kids? Are you tired of the same dusty old Zelda? Are you sick of moldy old tropes like the Temple of Time or Death Mountain? Do you wish your Zelda games would stop looking like this? Or this? Or even this? Would you rather play a game with blood and shit and Dark Souls bonfires? Then Zelda Sands of Time is the game for you, baby!
Sands of Time is an Ocarina of Time ROMHack created a couple weeks ago by Debug. It features no fewer than 8 completely new dungeons full of very well-designed puzzles and a sprawling overworld full of just the same. We're talking over 15 hours of brand spanking new content, from the fleshing out of underutilized concepts from the vanilla game to entirely new uses for old items. The world of Sands of Time is lovingly crafted, with some of the best and most unique visuals I've seen in a Zelda hack to date. You'll plumb the depths of a landfill and sprint down the halls of an overgrown factory, then retire to the fun barrel to get your milk on. The general pace of the game is more similar to Majora's Mask than Ocarina, where a big part of the journey is actually getting into the dungeons, not just the dungeons themselves. Now, this may all seem overwhelming at first. I mean, dirty, nasty, gross, icky locations like this in my Zelda? Where's my toy box aesthetic? Where are my Ubisoft towers and my strong playable women? I understand. It can be scary leaving your comfort zone like this. But what if I told you this game is Dark Souls? That's right, boys. Fire up those 3-hour lore videos for a single item, because we've got a lot of fat rolling to do. Dotting the grotelated remains of Hyrule are these bonfires, which will refill your health, magic, bombs, and arrows, as well as automatically fill all of your empty bottles with Lon milk. At first, I wasn't too sure about this mechanic, but the game is built around it, and it completely cuts grinding out of the picture. My only real issue with it is that it kind of devalues everything else you can put in your bottle. I mean, milk is already pretty good, and you can get it in infinite quantities pretty much all over the map instantly, so why would you ever bother catching a ferry or buying a potion? Really though, it's not that big of a deal, and the system works just fine. You've got a quick sip button for your Milky, and down on the D-pad, which also has your Lens of Truth and your other boots on it. I wish these were completely customizable because I would rather have my Ocarina on up rather than the Lens of Truth, but that's splitting hairs. Further quality of life changes include multiple methods of fast travel, with both songs and train stations that connect each major location, making getting to specific places in the world easier than ever. This is especially important since Sands of Time's world is very intricate and has a lot of long paths leading from one place to another. I hesitate to compare it to Skyward Sword because that only brings to my head negative associations, but the overworld has plenty of dungeon-like areas that aren't actual dungeons. These areas are all full of puzzles, and like I said before, they're great. Most of the puzzles in this game are things you'd never see in vanilla, but could still feasibly be made in vanilla, which I think is a super cool concept. Interesting new ways of using the iron and hover boots, cool torch puzzles, leading Armos knights into little holes to trap them forever, lots of fans, chicken gliding while under heavy artillery fire. This game is chock full of new scenarios to torture Link with. This is by far the best part of the hack, because you always find yourself doing something new. Even when you're trapped in the depths of a factory for hours, dodging BMOS firing squads and swimming in Mountain Dew, it doesn't feel like you're ever stuck doing the same thing. It's honestly impressive because those dungeons can get long. And dungeons. Oh boy, the dungeons. Sands of Time's dungeons are really the stars of the show here, with great layouts and of course, the puzzles. These sprawling labyrinths are pretty easy to get lost in though, especially since you're lacking a map, mini or otherwise. I never had too much trouble with getting totally lost, but it definitely would have been nice to have a map. That said, they're very difficult to make for custom areas, so I can understand their absence. The dungeons all have these great recursive looping designs, where you're never too far from a hub where you can heal up and restock, or sometimes even leave the dungeon if necessary. It was always a relief stepping through a door and realizing you were actually just a few rooms from the open air, despite feeling like you'd been maze running for hours. Now at this point you might be curious about the setting. I mean, factories, trains, blood, poopy, Hyrule in ruins? Well, the game starts with an explanation that, in this world, Ganon has been in charge for a long time. A real long time. Long enough that old man Ganon has finally bought the farm. The newly freed populace is in disarray, left with a Hyrule ravaged by industry and suffering. Now that Big Pig is gone, his power is scattered across the land in the form of 4 medallions, and everyone is scrambling to get them. I think. Probably. That is where you come in. You and your fairy, Mani, are after the medallions to get rich, and it doesn't matter how much really awful grammar and spelling you have to wade through. This game thankfully doesn't take itself too seriously, so it's more funny than anything. But sometimes it gets to the point that I can't even understand what's trying to be said anymore. I can't say I wasn't laughing my ass off at some of these, though. The tone of the game is generally humorous, but it does get serious from time to time. As for Link's arsenal, the items are mostly vanilla this time around, but there are a few differences aside from the absence of some items. The most prominent is that your boomerang is now a bomb-erang, which can be charged up to carry a bomb along its flight path, giving you a ranged bomb delivery system. This gets a lot of screen time, since you get it very early and it allows for a lot of unique explosion-based puzzle solutions and combat opportunities. The other change is the ice arrows gaining the ability to freeze water like in Majora's Mask, although it works more like the ice rune for Breath of the Wild. Like the boomerang, this is used extremely well, although they're acquired much later and don't get nearly as much time to shine. Another minor change is that the Zora tunic, which I didn't even get in my playthrough, prevents freezing in addition to its normal effect. I can't imagine that'll be particularly helpful, considering there's lava everywhere in this hack, so the Goron tunic is especially vital, but hey, it's still new. Let's talk combat. Most of the enemies in Sands of Time are reworked somewhat from vanilla Ocarina, such as Redeads and Gibdos being completely immortal unless burned to death, or some enemies being immune to your sword outright. This is where I feel the game stumbles the most. While I appreciate that enemies require more nuanced approaches rather than just quick spinning everything, no matter how hard I may have tried, it also means that every enemy encounter is a bigger deal than in the vanilla game unless you're very familiar with the ins and outs of Zelda 64 combat. Most enemies also deal more damage to compensate for your health being much more easily refilled, meaning that combat can sometimes feel like more of a chore than anything else. This goes triple for most of the bosses, which range from pretty fun to absolutely soul-drainingly miserable. Not helping this is that your strongest weapon against high HP bullshittery, the crouch stab, is heavily nerfed, with a massive delay between each stab. It can and will still trivialize combat if used well, but for an adult like me who hasn't mastered Ocarina, it lost a lot of its usefulness. Now, don't let my diatribe distract from the fact that there are tons of new and interesting enemies to be found in Sands of Time. While none of them are absolutely revolutionary, it's still refreshing to see so many new faces on the enemy roster, and it also helps to sell the world that we're meant to be exploring. Late in the game, you start seeing some really wild stuff too, including the final boss, which is a totally custom affair. While fighting things may have been frustrating at times, most of the time there was a new enemy involved, I tended to have something good to say about it. I won't do an exhaustive list of every new enemy or anything, since I don't want to spoil the game for those planning to play it, but there's enough here to keep you wondering what's around the next corner. Speaking of spoiling, I'm going to start rambling about some random things I liked or hated here or there, so if you want to play this for yourself, and I suggest you do, you can check out now. I don't want to spoil you on anything too in-depth, since I do think the surprise is a big part of the enjoyment. Just be sure to drop a like and a subscribe and a comment and a bell and a follow and a heart and a share and a hug and a kiss and a
Watch out!
Okay, what was the deal with switches in this game? You can either walk right over them or you've got to get up onto them with a backflip or a jump slash or something. It's like they weren't placed properly on the terrain. It was really weird and probably the most consistently annoying thing in the entire game. So be ready for that. I know I missed a bunch of stuff on my playthrough. Apparently there's an entire sub-chapter where you kill this guy's pet like, so he captures you and sells you into slavery on the black market. Yeah. I wonder if this is the only Zelda game with human trafficking. It leads to this dungeon where you have to do a lot of puzzles without any items at all, which is really neat, so I wish I could have done it for myself. I actually tried to kill the guy's like several times, but could never manage it since he throws you out every time you hurt it. As far as other optional content, I didn't do a ton of it. There's the usual Zelda fare, vanilla mini games, and heart pieces and all that. There are heart pieces all over the place. So many that it reminded me more of like missile tanks from Metroid than the way Zelda usually does it. There are also 120 Skulltulas. The rewards seem to be pretty run-of-the-mill, though the Stone of Agony does double the amount of health you get from your basic Sippy, so that one is a huge recommend. You get it for like 30 or 40 skulls, can't remember which one. I ended the game with something like 2/3 of the Skulltulas, like early 80s, late 70s. But by that point, I didn't care to go back and turn them in. Apparently that's how you get the Zora tunic too, so heads up if you really like blue. Alright, I'm gonna cap this review off with some random thoughts about each of the dungeons, since they really stuck out to me. Well, first off, you've got the landfill, which is like a borderline Conker's Bad Fur Day style shit heap, where you get the bomb bag. My favorite part of this dungeon is where you find yourself in a basketball court and have to shoot some hoops with bomb flowers to open the door. That one is pretty short though. Afterwards, you've got a long trek up Moblin Mountain to Sundown Castle. It's a Japanese-style castle, but it's all built from scrap metal and it's falling apart. It's so cool. You get the hook shot on your way up, and then the long shot inside, along with the bomberang. There's a very cool mechanic that pops up here a few times where you have to ring a bell with a bomb or your bomberang, and it rings so loudly it shatters an obstacle blocking your way. The boss of this dungeon is Wart from Majora's Mask, so it's not bad. Always cool to see imports pop up, and there are quite a few in this one. From this point, your options open up a bit. You've got the horror show underneath the fun barrel, which isn't unlike the bottom of the well. You get the iron boots here, or at least their equivalent. It's a shackle. This is where you fight Dead Hand, and he's the first really awful combat encounter in the game. He's got a couple of extra arms grafted onto his back, which make him basically impossible to attack with your standard sword, so you have to kill them first. Then he puts up a diarrhea shield, which you have to hope he doesn't decide to expand, because once he does that, you just have to run away until he decides to burrow back underground and start the whole thing over. Really, just awful. The best part about this place is that the Zoras here reference Master of Time like several times. It's also where all the mini-games are. They're all compacted into one place, which is pretty nice. After that, you've got the factory, which is also immediately available. You don't have to go to the fun barrel first. It's full of deadly machines and infested with likes. Since it was built smack in the middle of the Lost Woods, it's also being rapidly overgrown, creating an incredibly unique atmosphere, especially for Zelda. I can't help but get heavy Black Mesa vibes from this place, especially since the bonfires here are replaced with Half-Life style med stations. You get the hammer here, which has been remodeled but functions otherwise exactly the same. This is a huge leap as far as combat is concerned though, since most enemies that are immune to your sword are very weak to the hammer. The boss of the factory is a gigantic step down from Wart though. It's just a black iron knuckle, and there are already tons of those all over the dungeon to begin with. This guy is fast and he has a ton of health, and he also barely ever flinches. But if you just wail on him with the hammer with no regard for your own safety, you'll end up fine. There's also this totally optional dungeon you can seek out in the landfill known as Big Brother's Trial. This one is made easier with the hammer and other items, but you don't necessarily need them. There's not a whole lot here, mainly just puzzles involving BMOs, but your reward for finishing it is visiting the toilet fairy in her incredibly opulent fountain. This was one of my favorite moments in the entire game. I loved it so much, especially the part where she pisses in your face to upgrade your magic. Before you head to the desert afterward, you'll need to go around slaying some Poes for the weirdo in the hotel room next to yours. Once you've killed 10, you can get the hover boots from him, and you can use those to go to the Abyss, a creepy, hellish area that would look right at home in one of those really awful creepypastas. Although the concept of the Abyss is fantastic, I think the visuals tend to fall flat more often than not, since a lot of it just breaks down to walking through dark corridors and big, square, flat mazes. Like, the idea of a meat hell area in Zelda is super cool, and I think Sealed Palace also has a similar dungeon, but whenever it just turns into huge polygons stretching infinitely into the fog, it gets kind of lame. These hands in the meat areas are really cool though, and I did find this awesome burger. The boss of the Abyss is Dark Link, who drops the Lens of Truth when slain. It looks sick in this game, and it actually sticks to your face when you use it, and it even makes this cool noise. Side note though, the entrance to the Abyss is awesome. Absolutely the coolest thing in the game. I love it. After that, you can go to the desert and Ganon's tomb, but not before tackling a mini-dungeon in the form of a Hylian fortress. You're not exactly their favorite person, so you'll need to sneak around before finally stealing their prized horse in a surprisingly climactic moment. Then you have to make your way through a destroyed, cursed village, before finally making your way to Ganon's tomb proper. It's a pretty standard desert dungeon visually, but yeah, it still looks good. The treasures here are the fire and ice arrows, though their limited use cases unfortunately prevent them from being used together in any meaningful way. Still, the new uses for the ice arrows are cool, and collecting the fire arrows is cathartic, since most enemies in the game are weak to fire, and you now suddenly have a way to pull it out of your rear end. There are also a lot of cool puzzles involving the Armos here too. This is probably my favorite dungeon gameplay-wise. The boss is a Kaizo'd out Phantom Ganon. This guy does tons of damage and gives you very little time to attack him, making for another frustrating fight. In fact, I died twice during this game, once to Dead Hand and the second time to this guy. And when I did, I found out that you're locked in the room with no way to heal or refill your bottles, so I had to reset to get out. Fun. After that, you're headed to the Death Temple, the final area in the game. While it's an absolute visual spectacle, I also feel it's the weakest dungeon in the roster. While most of the dungeons have that really great recursive design I talked about earlier, the Death Temple is a confusing labyrinth that I reached the end of without ever really understanding it. Maybe that's the point. It is an interesting feeling. You're met with a couple big twists here. For one, Ganondorf has tricked you into bringing the medallions right to him so that he can resurrect himself. The bigger twist is that the final boss is actually really fun. Cyber Ganon is exactly what you'd expect based on the name. A missile-firing robotic titan that's ready to duke it out to the death. You can just wail on him with reckless abandon to see his badass pick you up and shoot you in the face animation, or you can lead his homing missiles into him to do tons of damage and get some free hearts. This guy is definitely the most fun combat encounter in the entire game, and boy do I wish all of the bosses were this good. And that's pretty much it. Despite the problems I had with Sands of Time, the good massively outshines the bad. For every moment I was frustrated or fed up with something, there were 10 where I was marveling at it. It definitely isn't as polished as something like, say, Missing Link or Indigo, but I'd say it more than meets expectations. I hope you'll end up enjoying it as much as I did, or maybe even more. That's all I got for Sands of Time, though. I've got a lot of other stuff to get to, so it's back to the old video game minds for me. This has been Torvis. Thanks so much for watching. God bless.